Welcome to Glass in Session, Season 22. I'm your host, Val, and I thank you for clicking play, for subscribing, for supporting the show, and joining me for another crazy season of Glass in Session. Now, I hope you enjoyed our little foray last season into the weirdness of booze disasters, fairy tales turned drunk history, and booze in space, which I unknowingly timed perfectly with the Artemis 2 launch. I mean, hashtag moonjoy, hashtag booze in space joy. Now, I don't think Artemis 2 had booze in space, so let's just get that out there. But like I said, I did the episode, then I noticed the launch was happening, and there you go. But since I started this solo venture in the world of wine casting, I have been striving to impress upon you that every pour has a story. I like to do things that are a little bit different than most wine podcasts. So today's story has nothing to do with booze, well, there are some disasters. I'm going to give you that straight up front. But no real fairy tales, no drunk history really, and no booze in space. But we might have some disasters. And we're going to stretch back, first of all, over 6,000 years. So yeah, things had to go wrong at some point. But we're going to wind through Roman temples and French Jesuits and a 15-year civil war. And we're going to land somehow in a glass that might just be one of the most compelling and emotionally resonant wines on the planet. Now, you already clicked play, so you kind of know where we're going. But this season, I am going to go ahead and dive back into the wine regions that have been looming on my editorial calendar for some time. This one is quite relevant. I even got a couple of Lebanese wines. That's where we are today. We're in Lebanon, and I'm going to pair them with this episode. So let's learn about the wines of Lebanon and one of the world's oldest societies and wine-producing regions. First, geography. Lebanon sits at the heart of what archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. Lebanon is tiny, about 10,400 square kilometers, which places it as number 35 on worldatlas.com's list of the world's countries from smallest to largest. It's somewhere between Cyprus, which we covered in Season 8, and just slightly behind and most comparable to Jamaica in size. And for you Americans out there, it's smaller than Connecticut. It runs roughly from north to south along the eastern Mediterranean shore. But despite that size, it packs 4 completely distinct parallel strips of terrain from west to east, which is why its climate and ecology are so wildly varied. The bordering countries, well, we have Syria wrapping it around up north in the entire east. Israel borders the south, and of course the west is the Mediterranean coastline, roughly 140 miles or 225 kilometers of it, which is Lebanon's natural outlet to the world and historically why Phoenician trade networks were so dominant. Now, the aforementioned 4 zones, we'll go over those really quickly because they're going to show up again in the Appalachians. So from west to east, we have the coastal strip, which is narrow lowland. And this is where we're going to find Beirut, Tripoli, and Sidon. And you've heard about all these places. Think classic, hot, humid Mediterranean summers, Mediterranean climates. So we're going to have some rain, effects from the sea. Nothing dramatic in terms of elevation, however. Now, Mount Lebanon is where we get the drama. It's that central spine of mountains that rises to over 10,000 feet at Kurnat al-Sada, and that's the highest peak in the Levant. It holds snow from roughly November through May, but it has cedar forests at elevation and creates a massive rain shadow effect. Now, this is the range that makes the whole Bekaa Valley possible, which is, as we move east, sitting at roughly 900 meters, almost 2,000 feet elevation between the 2 mountain ranges. It is the fertile, agricultural, and wine-producing heartland of the country. Now, the 2 flanking ranges block maritime moisture, which is drier than the coast, but the altitude does help keep the temperatures moderate, and we have over 300 sunny days per year. That diurnal temperature swing, like I said, that big difference between daytime and nighttime temperatures, critical for grape quality. It allows the grapes to hold their freshness in acidity, and yet still ripen fully from the sun. Now we move west to the anti-Lebanon range, which forms that natural border with Syria. It's drier and austere as compared to Mount Lebanon, and Mount Hermon is the highest peak there at about 9,200 feet. Now, the big climate takeaway for wine purposes is that Lebanon has more in common with parts of Spain and Greece in terms of sunshine hours, but its altitude puts it at some of the highest vineyards in the northern hemisphere. It gives the temperature moderation that preserves that acidity, as I mentioned earlier, and complexity. And it is sun-drenched, high-altitude terroir those grapes love. And that combination, it is pretty rare. Now, this is not just an iconic wine country, but it's an historic wine country. That's right. Long before there was Napa Valley, way before there was a Bordeaux, there was the Baca Valley. But we'll get back to the Baca, because per the usual, I just want to start with some histories with our first Cork Dork alert of the season, which is a flashback to the Cork Dork alert from the Corsica episode, season 11, Phoenicians versus Phocians. And we could really get into the nitpicky difference between the Phoenicians and the Phocians and nitpick our way through Corsican history, but that would be really geeky, wouldn't it? And who are we kidding? Let's get dorky with it. The Phocians were Greek colonizers and established themselves throughout the Western Mediterranean, such as, France. Marsalia, or today's Marseille, was their first in 600 BC. Nice, Agde, very close to where I studied wine, and Monaco would follow. The Phoenicians, on the other hand, they were originally from coastal Levant. We're talking Eastern Mediterranean in the areas of northern Israel, Lebanon, Syria, the African coast there. They established their settlements known as independent city-states beginning in 3200 BC, and they were famous for their maritime prowess, which developed into a colony empire and trading superpower by about 1200 BC. They've left their mark via fascinating trade route network throughout northern Africa, hello Carthage, Spain, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, even into the Black Sea. One more fun fact, it was the Phoenicians, not the Phocians, we can thank for today's alphabet, the ancestor to the very one that this day allows us to confuse ourselves with the difference between Phoenicians and Phocians in the first place. Fun, right? These Phoenicians, they called this coast home from around 3000 BCE. In fact, they probably referred to themselves more as Canaanites, and I've heard that used in different other podcasts as well, such as The Rest is History. They were talking about wine a couple weeks ago, and I just loved it because they did mention this particular time in history, particularly Lebanon and the Canaanites. Now, here's a little bit more historic geekery / cork dorkery that I don't think I've covered before, even though I have talked about the Phoenicians. The Greek word for purple is phoinos, which is where the word Phoenician comes from. I had no idea. It is because the Phoenicians spilled wine all over themselves, resulting in the purple color. No, I'm kidding. That is not why they named themselves after the color purple. Dear listener, the purple comes from the color resulting from boiling, get this, a big-ass sea snail called a murex. Apparently one of the Phoenicians' first popular trade items. So textiles were dyed this popular purple color, and the Greeks loved it. Pliny the Elder wrote about it and the massive resulting piles of sea snail shells by the seashore. And the color, imperial purple, became the synonym of aristocracy and royalty. Imperial purple is also referred to as Tyrian purple, as in the port of Tyre in southern Lebanon, which is a crucial seaport or hub of the Phoenician traders. It is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I should also mention that this boiled sea snail purple was all the rage of the Roman gladiators. Are you not entertained? But I will tell you, and I know this to be true, that I'm sure it is a great color for hiding wine stains. I wear a lot of purple and magenta for this reason, which brings us to the Romans. As the Phoenicians, named for boiled purple snail juice, who most likely called themselves Canaanites, weren't just the great traders of the ancient Mediterranean. Oh, no. They were the original wine missionaries. They carried Lebanese grape cuttings and winemaking know-how to Greece, to Carthage, and of course to the Romans, who totally dug what Lebanon was doing with the grapes. And proof that the Romans dug what the Canaanites were doing, what the Phoenicians were doing, the temple complex at Baalbek, which is approximately 50 miles northeast of Beirut in the vaunted Bekaa Valley. It was first a Greek city and now known as one of the most insane Roman ruins complexes on Earth and also a UNESCO World Heritage Site. I should also mention it is known as a Hezbollah stronghold. We'll get to that. But by the way, is it any coincidence that UNESCO World Heritage Sites are often near or in famous wine regions? I think not. I mentioned Baalbek because there is a temple of Bacchus, the Roman god of, say it with me, wine, among the ruins from the 2nd century. According to the Academie du Vin library book that I have on Chateau Musar, and we'll get to them, this temple of Bacchus is the, quote, largest known Roman monument to wine, end quote, complete with grape carvings in the stone. So So by the time we get to the Byzantine rule of the 7th century, long after the Romans, we start seeing what is now the country of Lebanon kind of taking shape, including Arab populations settling in the region. And I only mention this because usually during Arab rule, the wine industry tends to suffer. And I always say this is why we can't have nice things, but it's not always totally true. And also, what we know now as Beirut and Mount Lebanon were part of what we know today as Syria or the Damascus district. So it was in the Middle Ages we can actually find evidence of Tyre and Sidon wines being among the goods traded by the Venetians. Yes, those same Venetians in Italy. The Ottoman period, which was not always wine's friend as well, as alcohol was broadly suppressed, it began in the 16th century. Lebanon's borders still weren't what we see today, but you can see them taking shape, as I mentioned earlier. During this period, the Ottomans had the northern region under Aleppo's governance. The center region was governed by Damascus. Sidon ruled the south, and the Bekaa Valley and Lebanon's coast was under direct rule of Constantinople, or today's Istanbul. My point, it's so complicated to really just say this was this country back then, and wine's history does take a back seat for a while. And of course, grapes were still being grown because, once again, wine was needed for the churches, both the Christians and various orthodoxies. And during this time, Arak was still being produced, or Arak. And what is Arak, you ask? Well, this is a distilled spirit that falls into the anise-flavored categories, with the base ingredient being grapes. It's served similarly to absinthe, and I did a whole episode on that, which I will link up for you. And it does develop that louche like an absinthe. So if you want to learn what that is, I'll include that episode. You can check that out. So while Arak is considered Lebanon's national drink, other Arab countries do produce it. So maybe we'll do a whole separate episode on it for another day because it looks like a lot of fun to dive into. But let's get back to the wine, because right now we're pulling up the imperial wine truck to the 19th century, where we find French Jesuit missionaries planting vineyards in the Bekaa Valley. They too were looking to make sacramental wine, and what these church people actually did was lay the foundation for Lebanon's modern wine industry. The winery they founded in 1857, Chateau, is still the largest producer in Lebanon today. They brought some of the very great varieties I'm sipping right now, such as Cinsault and Carignan, and they paired these with the winemaking know-how from Algeria, which you may remember from the Algerian wine episode that the French colonized during this time. I'll link that episode up. And speaking of wine I'm sipping now, this one is from Domaine des Tourelles, founded in 1868 by François-Eugène Brun. It was also about the time American Protestants were planting their missionary flags in places like Beirut. Then came the French Mandate period after World War I, and voila, Lebanon was under French administration, French culture, French cuisine, French wine sensibilities. All that tended to seep into their culture. And a fun aside, Charles de Gaulle was also posted in Beirut around 29 to 31, serving in military operations and intelligence. And I linked a couple articles on that. They are in French. But this brings us to 1930 and a man named Gaston Hochar and a little winery called Chateau Musar. Gaston Hochar founded Musar in 1930, inspired by his time studying in France. Medicine originally in Paris, but then he was bitten by the wine bug, as what happens with many wine lovers and has happened for generations. He befriended a British military officer also stationed in Lebanon, Major Ronald Barton of Chateau Léoville Barton of Médoc fame. Now, the good Major's influence would result in the would-be doctor/grape transporters turned wine lover Gaston to plant Cabernet Sauvignon alongside the local varieties. And this, boys and girls, is basically why Lebanese reds have a Bordeaux flair. Hochar's first vintage was in 1933, and his buddy Ronald not only dug it, but encouraged him to keep up the great work. Meanwhile, the French army was quite happily buying up Chateau Musar's offerings and issuing them to officers stationed throughout the Levant area of operations. And I'll certainly drink to that. Now, Gaston's son, Serge Hochar, took over winemaking in 1959, and he is considered an absolute rock star in the wine industry to this day, as he shepherded Musar's winemaking through Lebanese Civil War from 1975 through 1990, 15 years, and through almost all of it, Hochar made wine. He only lost 2 harvests to the fighting. In 1982, it got real in the vineyards at Musar because after Israel's invasion of Lebanon, 80 hectares of Musar's Bekaa Valley vineyards were, no kidding, the front line between Syrian and Israeli tanks. The Bedouin pickers were like, we got this. They were quite loyal to the harvest, as some of them had been harvesting those grapes for generations for this family. These Bedouin badasses went out there and harvest the grapes they did. And then Musar's trucks navigated the war zone to bring the grapes back to the winery. The 1982 vintage exists because of extraordinary human courage, a vintage that Hochar calls a pure wine of war. A vintage that I would suspect has prominent notes of "come at me, bitches," followed by long persistent finish of "not on my watch, pair with these nuts." And we see why I'm not seeking a place in the circle of wine writers anytime soon, don't we? Let's state that a little bit more eloquently in the words of one of the most innovative wine writers to ever make one want to drink his wine words from the page, Andrew Jefford. The 82 vintage was, quote, typically Musar in its enigmatic simplicity/complexity, end quote. Chateau became another major wine producer in 1978, although its wine-growing roots, date back to 1951 when it first planted vines and supplied grapes to other winemakers in the region. And one unique thing about Cafreya is the amphorae they use to age some of their wines. In 1979, we're just kind of going through the timeline here, Hochar traveled to the Bristol World Wine Fair in the UK. One wine critic and writer, Michael Broadbent, tasted the 1967 Musar and he declared it the, quote, find of the fair, end quote. And the international wine world was on alert. And in 1989, the winery itself was shelled and the family actually opened the cellars as a bomb shelter for the locals. In the mid-1990s, there were a whopping 5 wineries in Lebanon. In 1996, Lebanon joined the OIV, or Organisation Internationale de la Vigne et du Vin, just the OIV. I regularly read Blue Sky or Skeet or whatever they call it, their graphics and historical photos all the time. They are rich with so much information, wine facts, data, figures, pictures, papers, etc. They're constantly doing events with really smart wine people out there. And then a year after joining the OIV, Lebanese wine producers founded the Union Vinicole du Liban, or UVL. By 2018, there were nearly 50 producers, and some sources have quoted nearly 80 producers, so I'll just say that there's somewhere between 50 and 80 because I really don't know, depends on your source. But I'm just trying to give you the overall 411 here because today Lebanon produces between 9 and 10 million bottles of wine annually. About 3 million of these bottles are exported, which brings us to the wine. In nearly every episode I write on wine regions, I do try to break down the geography of the appellation or the growing regions into bite-sized chunks. This time it's a bit of a challenge, as let's just say the appellation system is still, as we used to say in the military, carved in jello. So while there are moves afoot to establish something similar to France's AOC system via the INVV, or the Institute of Vine and Wine in English, originally established in 2013, I haven't been able to nail down production and certification rules or formal demarcations of appellations. But the INVV's board is in coordination with the aforementioned OIV, and the current board of directors, comprised of winemakers and representatives from the Ministries of Agriculture, Economy and Trade and Industry, I want to say the current head of the board is still the president of Chateau. They have like 3-year appointments. And I think because of the world events, they were just kind of reappointed. There wasn't an election, something similar to that effect. So let's just go with this. And the wine map PDFs I linked up for you in the show notes. The Bekaa Valley, again, is the undisputed center of the universe for Lebanese wine. That's mostly what you're going to see and where we're going to find many of the wineries you have already heard about or will hear about today. Western Bekaa is where we find a large part of the 3,000 or so hectares of vines, but I've linked up a map that seems to have subdivided the Bekaa as well as the Mount Lebanon region to the west with its more Mediterranean climate. But those subdivisions are different depending on which map you're looking at. So the northwest of the country, we have the Batroun that is either 8 or 9 wineries, comes in second in terms of production, either from sea-facing or inland vineyards, some very modern New World styles coming out of there. And you'll hear more about these other regions, such as the Chouf, and there's a hearty chunk of vineyards south of both Mount Lebanon and the Bekaa, and just cuts off the bottom corner of the country called the Jazine. 1 or 2 wineries here at high altitude that does take advantage of the cooling breezes from the Med. As for the wines, the red rules as the dominant international varieties are Cabernet Sauvignon, which brings structure and that unmistakable backbone to the wine. There's Merlot for the smoothness and that dark fruit, black cherry, things like that, and Syrah, which is where we get our peppery spice and complexity. But most Lebanese reds are going to be blends, and they often have a particular flavor signature. Dark brooding fruit, yes, but also spice and cumin and sumac. Some say incense and rosewater, flavors that distinctly speak of the Levant, if you will. Cinsault is that variety from southern France that was planted way back with the 19th century French Jesuits, so it's had a while to get comfortable, and it is having a moment in Lebanon. And this could be what the winemaker from Domaine de Tourelle says is Lebanon's signature variety. It's in both of the wines I opened for this episode. Now, there's a picture on my Instagram of both bottles. The one is from Chateau Musar. It is a rosé. And then there's a red from the Domaine de Tourelle, and both wines are from the Bekaa Valley. According to the UVL website, more than 50% of the wine grape plantings are comprised of Cabernet Sauvignon and Cinsault, which is why we talk so much about Cinsault, since that's kind of dominating their vineyards there. But then there's these indigenous varieties that Lebanese winemakers are increasingly excited to rediscover. And these kind of things are what I usually look for. I usually look for the unusual things, but finding Lebanese wine for me is unusual. So if I can find this white grape Merwa and this Obeda, then, I'm going to look for it. Merwa is apparently related to Semillon. In fact, if you go to the wine grapes book that I reference often in this podcast, that just says C. Semillon. So it's kind of related to that. And Obeda is believed to be related to Chardonnay. Together, these indigenous white grapes of Lebanon make Chateau Musar's famous long-aging white wine. But separately, they also can make fresh, fruity, light-bodied wines with the Merwa at Chateau Cassara, and the Coteau du Liban makes an Obeda loaded with stone fruits and citrus from 35-year-old pergola-trained vines. Together, they are also the grapes of choice for the Iraq spirit I mentioned earlier, or the Iraq. Lesser-known native reds include Morad and Suba, and I'm going to stop there, but there are 3 others. I'm not going to pronounce them, but these names don't exactly roll off the tongue. But winemakers are working with these grapes, just like they are in the Israeli wine episode I mentioned, because they want to bring them back from extinction. This is going to bring me to the final block of this show. My final sip is a little serious. It is paired with a bit of snark, so bear with me. Because with all that's going on in the Middle East, in addition to the jackassery foisted upon us globally by the world's dumbest mediocre white men who have the common sense of frat boys, or as I like to say, this is why we can't have nice things, Lebanon is still under attack. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, connected to the broader regional war that ignited after October 7th, 2023, it escalated sharply in September 2024. And when it did, it escalated directly into the Bekaa Valley, right into freaking wine country. Chateau Rayak was severely damaged by the bombing in September 2024 during harvest, leaving over 60 metric tons of grapes on the vines as they were not pickable after the attack. Nearly 7,000 bottles were destroyed, as was their lab. Yet that year, somehow Lebanon was still able to produce about 15 million bottles. Remember, I said they normally produce between 9 and 10 million a year? That year, somehow, they produced 15 million. I don't know. But even in recent days, the Bekaa Valley is still taking rounds. I've linked up the 2025 report from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or the FAO, on Lebanon's agricultural damage and loss assessment on the impact of the conflict. If you want to read it, it is devastating. The report details how the conflict has hit more than 4,000 hectares of crops and vineyards, mostly in the Baalbek and another district. Some farmers have raised fears also about the long-term impact of white phosphorus use on their soil. So you might be asking, WTF, Val? Are Hezbollah just winos hiding out amongst our Cinsault vines, swirling and sipping and making tasting notes? Turns out it's complicated. Hezbollah is known for storing their weapons and hiding out, building their little rat tunnels and bunker infrastructure amongst civilian communities. And the Bekaa Valley is one of their most famous hangs, including the city of Baalbek I mentioned earlier. The people of Lebanon and their wine deserve far better than my editorializing on this shitty situation, so I will cease the flapping of my gums on the non-diplomatic dick swinging, as it does not help these people. But hopefully buying, appreciating, talking about their wine, their history, and their legacy does, in whatever small way, help. So buy up. Nothing political about that. To close this out, I have a quote for you from page 67 of the Chateau Musar book I mentioned earlier from the Academie du Vin library. The quote is from 2006, when the owner of Chateau Musar, Serge Hochar, opened a bottle of 1974 red for his workers during bombings by Israel back then. This was 20 years ago. I do remember when this was happening. And he said, quote, "Lebanon is like the phoenix. You can bomb us, invade us, burn our villages, and fight your wars here. You can destroy us 7 times, and each time, Lebanon, like the phoenix, will rise." End quote. So when you open a bottle of Lebanese wine, you're embodying, if not empowering, history. And I am honored that of all the wine podcasts out there, mine is the one you listened to this week, including my little editorializing at the end. So I thank you for bearing with me. I thank you for sharing these batshit crazy times with me in your ear. And I thank you for subscribing, which keeps this precious spot open for me in your podcast feed. You can always reach out to me via email. Email me at val@glassandsession.com or glassandsession@proton.me, or the socials. Pick your poison. Blue Sky, Glass and Session. Vina with Val on Threads and Instagram. You'll see Glass and Session in my bio. I'm on Spoutable sometimes, Glass and Session. I'm on Substack now, glassandsession.substack.com. I'm Vina with Val on Pinterest and on Facebook/Glass and Session. And sometimes Facebook kind of messes with my page and says, oh, we're not recommending it. You didn't follow the rules, but I don't know what rules I didn't follow, and it never tells me. And then it says, oh, you're okay now. So whatever, Facebook. So sometimes I'm on Facebook. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Valerie Caruso, DWS, FWS, letters, wine stuff, and audiobook narrator. Which reminds me, you can find this podcast and the latest audiobooks I've narrated on Audible. My latest book is by Pacific Northwest wine and spirits writer Becky Garrison, in which she draws on her real-life experiences and time as a religious satirist. It's called Gaslighting for God, a satirical guide to save yourself from spiritual narcissists. It's funny, it's snarky, it's oh so timely, and I truly enjoyed being the voice of this insightful book. It is a serious subject, but she keeps it light, full of satire, which you need. And if you've survived any kind of narcissistic abuse or trauma from religious or even mindfulness institutions, you'll be able to help guard against these practices in the future, doing you further harm. And as a wine and spirits educator and communicator, I very much appreciated and could relate to the chapter on finding community in all places in sharing a glass of wine, which is what we're doing here, either in a tasting room or in a festival. It's a really cool chapter, and most of the events are in the Pacific Northwest because that's where she is. So if you're looking for a great place for community, more than just getting drunk, but, understanding the marriage of sunlight with the grape and a glass of wine, which is something we all love, I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes if you want to reach out to me via email or social media or DM me, whatever. I'm happy to send you a code for a free review copy. So if you want to get it that way, let me know. I will also mention there is Glass and Session swag in my TeePublic store, linked way at the bottom of the show notes and on my website. I thank those of you who are supporting the show. Glass and Session is a production and registered trademark of Vina with Val, LLC. Music is Write Your Story by Joystock. Website is glassandsession.com/podcast.